Hey, everybody. On Easter, we got to walk through Psalm chapter 22, which is just an incredible prophecy of Christ's sufferings and his resurrection, written by King David 1,000 years BC, 1,000 years before Christ was crucified or even born. And it's a staggering prophecy, just incredible. The detail of the crucifixion, from dice being cast for his clothing, his heart turning to wax, his water being poured out, his joints, his bones out of joint, him being mocked for his trust in the Lord, him being surrounded by dogs, Gentiles, Roman soldiers, essentially, him being forsaken by God. I mean, this is an astonishing prophecy. I want to zero in on the most controversial phrase in the chapter, which is verse 16. For dogs encompass me, a company of evildoers encircles me. They have pierced my hands and feet. Now, that's the most controversial part of this chapter because it is a textual variant. What that means is when you go back to the original language, which was Hebrew, and you look at the various manuscripts that we have, not all the manuscripts use the word pierced or dug through or bored through or pierced. Not all of them do that. In fact, perhaps even more surprising, the majority of our Hebrew manuscripts do not read pierced my hands and feet. The majority do not. The minority read pierced my hands and feet. The majority read something else that I'll explain in a moment. So, our Old Testament is based primarily on a group of Hebrew texts known as the Masoretic text, okay? These are written by the Masoretes, a Jewish group of scholars who worked really between, say, the 500s and about the year 1000 AD. The oldest complete Old Testament in Hebrew that we have is the Leningrad Codex, or the Leningrad Book, essentially, Codex, which dates to about the year 1000, maybe the year 1008 or so. And some of the other ones from the Masoretic text tradition are from about the year 900. So our Old Testament is based primarily on Hebrew texts from the years 900 and 1000 and a little bit past that in the Masoretic text tradition. And the majority of those texts don't say pierced my hands and feet. So at this point, you might say, well, then is this just the bias of Christian translators? You know, the ESV or the NASB or the NIV or the whatever. These are translated by largely, but they're translated by Christians. And so maybe there's a Christian bias going on here. Okay, all right, let's talk about that. Here are the arguments in favor of pierced my hands and feet being the original reading. Okay, in favor. So, first of all, I want to mention what I mentioned on Sunday, which is the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, if you don't remember what the Dead Sea Scrolls actually are, the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in these caves, the Qumran caves near the Dead Sea, of all places, not that far from Jerusalem, where a group of Jews called the Essenes very likely lived and did a lot of their work. In the 1940s, people found at the back of these caves, they found these kinds of vessels here of pottery that contained these priceless Old Testament Hebrew scrolls that had essentially been buried there, probably when the Romans tried to kill the Essenes in around the year 70 AD. And they'd been there for 2,000 years, like in a time capsule, just totally forgotten, unknown, and then found serendipitously, and there they are. So if you want to know what they actually look like, someone has said that the Dead Sea Scrolls could better be called the Dead Sea Confetti because most of the fragments are tiny, tiny scraps. We're talking here absolutely tiny scraps that are fragmentary, so you don't even have complete sentences, but they do give us glimpses into the oldest copy of the Old Testament. That's what you're dealing with. You can see here a fragment of the book of Leviticus in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and you can just see how incredibly fragmentary. This is what when we say Dead Sea Confetti, we're looking at scraps that small. We have to figure out what part is being referred to and what all it means. So those are the Dead Sea Scrolls. Well, there are two fragmentary copies of Psalm 22 in the Dead Sea collection. And you can buy, as I have here, a complete English translation of every fragment and every verse and every bit of the Old Testament that we have from the Qumran caves, from the Dead Sea Scrolls. And when you flip to Psalm 22, of the two manuscripts, only one deals with our controversial phrase about the hands and feet. And this copy was written over 100 years before Jesus was born. So it was not written by a Christian. It was written before Christians existed. It was written by a Jew in a scene 100 years before Christ. And this is what the oldest copy of the Hebrew text says. It's fragmentary. They have placed, gap, as the dust of death, gap. Dogs are, gap. A gang of evil, gap, encircles me. They have pierced my hands and feet. So there it is. The words are actually there in the text. They have pierced my hands and feet. So the oldest copy by 1,000 years of the Hebrew text, not biased by Christian copyists because they weren't Christians. The oldest Hebrew text that dates before the time of Christ has pierced my hands and feet. But there's more to it than just that. So, a lot of Jews wanted to be able to read their Old Testament in the Greek language because of, if you remember, Hellenization, where the Greek culture was spread. And so many Jews spoke Greek even better than they would have spoken or read Hebrew. And so they needed the Bible of their time in Greek. And so a group of translators, legend has it there were 70 of them. That's why it's called the LXX, the 50 plus 10 plus 10, the 70. The LXX, the Septuagint translation. And the Septuagint translation of the Old Testament is a pre-Christian Greek translation. So it was translated between 250 and about 150 BC. So over a century before Jesus was born, this translation into Greek was made. And the Septuagint, in my understanding, unanimously in the manuscripts of the Septuagint, translate the verse, they have pierced my hands and feet. So you have the pre-Christian earliest translation, pierced my hands and feet. You have the earliest Hebrew text that dates 100 years before Jesus, they have pierced my hands and feet. But it gets even better than that. In the 300s, an early Christian named Jerome translated the Bible into Latin. It's called the Vulgate. It was the primary Bible of the Catholic Church, really, for 1,000 years, in the kind of throughout the Middle Ages as well. But that translation, Jerome was working from texts that had to exist in the year 380. That's when he's translating it. So these are really old texts that no longer exist of the Old Testament that he was working with. And when he translated into the Latin, he translated it. Now, I know he was a Christian, but he translated it in the 300s, they have pierced my hands and feet. So the earliest translation to Latin, they have pierced my hands and feet. Then, in fact, before that, I skipped one, the Syriac translation, which was done, I believe it's in the 2nd century. It was done in the 100s. It's one of the earliest translations as well. The Syriac translation also has, they have pierced my hands and feet. So the only time when you get to a majority of texts that no longer have pierced, you're dealing with the Masoretic text in the 900s AD and the year 1000 AD, much later. So when you look at the earliest Hebrew text in the Dead Sea Scroll, it's pierced my hands and feet. When you look at the Septuagint, the Greek translation before Jesus, it's pierced my hands and feet. When you look in the 100s and you look at the Syriac translation in the 2nd century, you have pierced my hands and feet for verse 16. And when you look at Jerome's Latin Vulgate translation in the 380s, you have pierced my hands and feet. And when you look at the Masoretic text tradition, you still have a number of Hebrew texts that translate it, pierced my hands and feet, or dug through, or bore through my hands and feet. It's only the majority of Hebrew text done by Jewish copyists in the 900s that you then have another reading. And you could even argue, I know people always say Christian bias, Christian bias. Well, you know, there could also be an Orthodox Jewish bias that might want to go the other direction away from pierced because it seems to so clearly point to the Jesus of Christianity. And so what do the majority of Hebrew texts say instead of pierced? The majority of Hebrew texts read this way. The verse goes, "For dogs encompass me, a company of evildoers encircles me, like a lion, my hands and feet." Like a lion, my hands and feet. Now, the word, by the way, the word lion, the word pierced or dug through, The words are almost identical in Hebrew. There's just, I think, one pen stroke difference between the two words, which makes it even more tricky. You could see how it could go one way or the other by an accident in copying as well. So whether it was intentionally changed or not is beside the point. Let's say that that is the original reading, what the majority text says in Hebrew. Like a lion, my hands and feet. Well, what's missing? What's missing is a verb. There is no verb. You would have to try to supply a verb from the earlier part of the verse, maybe in circles. Like a lion, they encircle my hands and feet. I'm not sure how you would try to interpret it, but there is no verb. Like a lion, my hands and feet. So people have supplied words like a lion, they are at my hands and feet, or other things like that. Well, here's what I want to ask. Let's just say that that is the original reading. Like a lion, my hands and my feet, my hands and feet. Well, here's the question we have to ask. The lion in this text, lions have already been mentioned. They're attacking you. What does an attacking, ravening, ferocious, hungry lion do to your hands and your feet? I heard someone say the other day, the answer is not that they come up like your puppy dog and lick your hands and your feet. Okay, that's not a hungry, ravenous lion like the lion mentioned earlier in the chapter in verse 13. Like a ravening and roaring lion, they open their mouths at me. That lion does not come and lick your hands and feet like a puppy. This lion, if it's going to do anything to your hands and feet, it's going to do one of two things. What do you think those would be? They're either going to bite your hands and feet, which would involve your hands and feet being pierced by their teeth, or they are going to claw your hands and feet, which would involve your hands and feet being pierced by their claws. An attacking lion is going to interact with your hands and feet with their teeth or their claws, which is going to end up with you being attacked and pierced in your hands and feet either way. But on top of that, how strange is it that the author David would be referring to like a lion, my hands and feet? Well, if a lion is attacking you, wouldn't your hands and feet be the last part of your body you'd be worried about talking about? Wouldn't you be worried about the lion attacking your head or your chest or your torso area? I mean, that's the area you would want to protect. Like a lion, they're coming at my head, they're coming at my body. But no, he says like a lion, my hands and feet. Why emphasize the hands and feet? David is writing about a sufferer who is experiencing some kind of vicious attack against his hands and feet. And if the lion is involved, it could be a piercing. So either way, the hands and feet are the targets, and likely piercing is the activity. And so you're stuck with the same problem, which is what? You still have this strange, conspicuous attention on the hands and feet of this victim, with likely piercing being included. But I really don't think that that is the original reading. I sincerely think that pierced my hands and feet is the original reading. Now, aside from all that, how about this point? The New Testament never once explicitly quotes that verse as fulfilled prophecy in Jesus being pierced with the spear or pierced with the nails in his hands and feet. Not once is there an explicit reference to Psalm 22, verse 16 in the entire New Testament. So even if the reading is like a lion, my hands and feet, it doesn't mess anything up at all as far as biblical prophecy is concerned. But that being said, I really do think because the earliest Hebrew text in the Dead Sea Scrolls by 1,000 years has pierced, the earliest translation in the Greek predating Jesus has pierced, I think in all the manuscripts, if I've understood correctly. Also, the Latin Vulgate, the dominant Bible of the church for a millennia, has pierced, and the Syriac translation has pierced, and a number of Hebrew texts in the Masoretic text have the word pierced. So pierced is the overwhelming reading, it's the earliest reading, and it's the earliest translated reading. So I think it is by far the more reliable reading. But either way, we don't lose anything in the end, whichever way we look at it.